Beautiful. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for the time today. I know I stand between you and coffee. So when I first was asked to speak, I was given about half an hour to talk, and I thought, well, half an hour, that's typical what happens with security, right? We get relegated to a little bit of time, but hopefully I can use that time wisely today. I know there's a lot of things that you want to cover off today. So just quickly, pushing the button, just give you a quick background on me just so you understand why I'm talking about security and where I come from. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges we face when we move to the cloud. I'm going to talk about visibility because that's really, I think, one of the biggest challenges, keeping that visibility when we move. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about something called the Cloud Security Alliance. And then finally, I have some calls to action for you. So hopefully I can bang that all into about half an hour. And then at the end, we do have about 10 minutes set aside for questions, if there are any questions. So this is me. Mentioned the dirt bike rides, my favorite picture likely. I do a lot of riding, but this is me most of the time. So this is what I think a lot of people in the room can relate to and recognize. And my friend Dave Spencer is here, and I think he has the exact same challenges. So if you think about moving to the cloud, here I'm dealing with challenges with security tools all the time. And for the same reason that you folks are focused on moving a lot of the infrastructure out of your environments and into the cloud, it's the same thing in the security world. We have the same challenges with tools and technologies. As Peter just talked about with TriNimbus, the traditional tools, they work great and they do the things they're supposed to do, but everything's got this migration path to move it to the cloud, and how do we bring the security along with it? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. And of course, as I say, Dave is always fighting with security, so I thought that was a good little slide. I've been doing security for a long time, about 20 years. I had built up an information security company called Sentry Metrics, and I sold that off a couple of years ago. But I had developed technology that we were using to deliver our managed services to customers. It was a cloud-based security platform, and so I kept that technology, and that's my new company, UseAuto. So I'm focused on risk management, compliance management, operations management from the cloud. So let's start off our cloud discussion with this is one of the biggest challenges, I guess, I find from a security perspective, is that people just don't understand the cloud. So just a quick anecdote that goes along with this cartoon. The reality is that people just don't understand what it is, and they don't even understand when they're using it. I do a lot of interviews, if you will, with companies when they're trying to build security programs, information programs, compliance programs. So working with a very large company here in Toronto, about $700 million a year. And I was interviewing a lot of the employees and getting an idea of the things that they were doing as it related to the cloud. And the last person I interviewed was the COO. And so one of the questions I asked him was, how are you using the cloud today? And he said, well, we don't use the cloud. He said, we have a policy that we don't use any cloud services. We don't trust them. We want to keep everything internally. And I said, oh. I said, well, what are your salespeople using to manage their sales activities? He said, I think we use Salesforce. And I said, well, you understand that's a cloud service? And he said, well, I guess so. And I said, what are you using for your accounting? And he said, well, we have our stuff's hosted downtown somewhere. We have all of our accounting with some other company that takes care of it for. So, well, you understand that's a cloud service. And then the Dropbox reference came up because before I met with him, interviewing the developers, they had locked down all the computers. The ports were blocked, so you couldn't copy stuff onto USB. And so the developers had come up with a solution, which was to copy not code, but customer data up to the cloud, to Dropbox, so that they could work off-site when they were working from home nights and weekends. So they had all this customer data that was spread around on Dropbox. And when I mentioned it to him, he said, oh, that's interesting. Maybe that's why Dropbox has been calling me and telling me I should really get a corporate account, because I have all these people that have, with their domain names, set up accounts with Dropbox. So anyways, I think that really lends itself to the discussion when people start to think about moving to the cloud. It really is my first and most important point, I guess, is people just don't understand what it is. A lot of businesses don't understand it. Certainly the business people that are wanting to take advantage of it don't understand it. And from a security point, unfortunately, a lot of the security people don't really understand it as well. So, it was interesting, Kent made a comment about the security being superior when you move to the Amazons of the world. And I've been doing this for a long time, so maybe I'm old school, but I would maybe clarify that or qualify that. I think that can be. I think that there's a real opportunity to have superior security because you can focus on things that maybe the organization itself can't. But I think there's a lot of work that needs to go into it. I don't think that you just move it to the cloud and it magically works. And again, I think Peter just talked about that when he was doing his TriNimbus discussion. That's the challenge, is people are trying to do things the same way they used to do it, and it simply doesn't always work. So certainly people are migrating, and again, as you saw Peter's slide, which was quite true, people are doing the migration and they're assuming that when they move things, it's just going to magically work the same way that it did when it's in their environment, and it just doesn't work that way. Some things can, from a technology point, from an operations and a service and a performance and all those things, you may get superior performance, but from a security point, there's a lot of trade-offs that take place. So when we start to move, what are the things that we need to think about? Well, obviously, there's a lot of things to consider when you're moving from your traditional, whether it's your local VMs, local physical machines, moving into the cloud. Some of the things that we need to tackle, of course, right off the bat is user access and user permissions. How are users going to be able to work? Because fundamentally, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how secure the environment is or how fast the environment is or how scalable the environment is. If the users can't access it, then it doesn't really matter. Obviously, we've got our data that's sitting there. We've now moved it into a location that's outside of our control, and so we have to ensure that that data is protected. Somebody has to be taking care of it. How are we going to ensure that our data is being managed properly? Access to the data itself. Obviously, we want to make sure the right people get access to the right information at the right time. Understanding who's accessing what and when they're accessing it. I mean, we need to have that visibility, if you will. And certainly, finally, the data residency issue, and it's great to hear from Eric that we're going to have our Canadian region up and running very soon, so that's incredibly exciting for everybody from an AWS perspective. Take away some of those data residency issues, but even when you're dealing with some providers, or especially some cloud providers, I have a Canadian data center, but where is it being backed up to? Well, it's being backed up somewhere else. So how do we know where that data is actually residing? So these are a lot of the things that we have to be thinking about. From a across the board perspective, and again, I've only got a bit of time to talk about security today, so I thought I would focus on one area that could get you thinking about, which is visibility. So in order to be able to manage security, Peter Drucker says it best, you can't manage what you can't measure. And so if you can't see things, if you can't understand what's happening, if you don't have that visibility to understand who's doing what, how they're doing it, what's happening from the outside coming to your systems, if we don't have that level of visibility, then we can't effectively manage things. And that's one of the biggest challenges in the security world. Whether you're doing things locally or doing things cloud-based, you have to have that level of visibility. So today, where do we get our visibility from? Well, there's lots of traditional sources. We get them if we're dealing with internal systems and resources, our servers, our network devices, looking at the network itself, activity, whether we're doing monitoring of the traffic itself, security devices. We have some great sponsors today. Sumo Logic is great at log monitoring, Trend Micro providing that security level from an endpoint perspective, so Cloud Checker doing security. So you've got these different folks that are focused on different aspects. And of course, Amazon delivers a great platform from a security point once you get out to the cloud, but how do you look at the things locally? So, how do we get what are the things we're looking at locally, and then how do we sort of transition that to the cloud? We've got lots of people connecting remotely, so commuting's working, or telecommuting's working wonderfully, lots of people working from home. We don't really care where people are these days as long as they can get access to the data in a secure fashion, but we need to know what they're accessing, of course. The applications themselves, we're getting better at writing applications that we're actually logging the information coming from them. There's been a real challenge with visibility from an application point for a long time, but I think people are really starting to understand they need to be able to see what's happening in the applications themselves. Not from a developer's perspective because they want to understand errors or performance or things like that, but from a user perspective. How are the users using the application? And then from a security perspective, how are the users using the application, and are they doing the things they're supposed to be doing, or are they doing things they're not supposed to be doing? And then finally, another data source that we need to consider is scanning from a identification of vulnerabilities and insecurities. Doing vulnerability scans against our assets. We can do that hopefully locally. We do application testing, we do source code testing, source code reviews and that. So all of that information needs to be used in some way locally, and now we need to take that information and we need to try to get that same information once we move to the cloud. Some of the things that we lose, of course, when we move, we lose visibility right off the bat in some cases to the logs from the devices that we were traditionally getting our information from, so where we'd be seeing activity, we lose some of that information, or we need to make sure we keep it if we change the different types of devices, obviously. From a user perspective, that's one of the biggest areas of change where we have all these nice systems internally today where we can track and monitor and see what the users are doing, but once the services are being delivered from outside, how do we still track what the users are actually doing? How do we get that visibility into what the users are doing themselves? We need to obviously maintain that. And then one of them, again, I mentioned that my customer, unfortunately, who has got data all over the place. How do we understand what data is stored and where that data is stored? How do we keep that level of visibility? If it's on our local servers, whether it's virtual or physical, if it's inside our environment, at least we can say, well, we're confident and comfortable that the data is inside our environment and we have some level of control over it. But as soon as we move that data outside of our environment, we lose that visibility. We lose that understanding of what data is stored where and who's accessing it, how are they accessing it, when are they accessing it, et cetera. And then, of course, back to that data residency concern, right? Now I've got my data stored with a cloud provider, or I'm using some type of a cloud service, and how do I ensure that my data isn't inadvertently being transferred to somewhere that I don't want it to be, or either because from a compliance perspective, a regulatory perspective, my data isn't supposed to be outside of my environment. So this is my simple answer. Let's block access to everything. This one works really well. I like Dilbert. I'm a Dilbert fan. So the reality is, of course, in the information security world, if we could do what security tells us to do, we use something called the method of least privilege access. That's where we block access to everything by default. So from a security point, if I could block access to everything by default and only explicitly allow access to the things that people need to do, life would be much easier. So in the traditional world where a lot of people are living still, as they're migrating, we've still got hybrid environments, things like that. We're still dealing with the opposite, right? The reality is, in most cases, we give users access to almost everything, and then as security people or IT people, we end up spending a significant amount of our time trying to figure out how to stop people from doing the things we don't want them to do. If we could use that method of least privilege access, we could actually start by saying, I'm not going to allow, or I need to map out or understand how people are going to access things or what they need to access, and only allow them access. And that's one of the biggest things I think the cloud, the migration to the cloud offers organizations, is a chance for a reset. So all the things you're allowing in your environment, we talk about admin access and things like that, those things really go away because people don't need them anymore, or they don't have the same significance any longer. And so when we're moving people or moving services, moving applications to the cloud, there's a real opportunity to incorporate some of that method of least privilege access into the things that we're doing. So while we may not be able to go to the extreme of blocking access, we can start to think about preventing or at least limiting the things that people are doing. And because we're introducing something new in a lot of cases, we're introducing a new way of using the existing services, there's an opportunity for people that are going to be more, accepting, or at least more willing to have the discussion around not having the same level of access or the same level of capabilities necessarily if there are security considerations. And so there's a real opportunity to have that discussion, which we simply haven't had before. So I just looked at security, I guess, from maintaining that visibility or compensating for that visibility when we move to a couple of different things. So the first place is the hosting provider. So of course, AWS and certainly other providers as well, but AWS has their CloudTrail as an example. There's different solutions that they offer, different levels of visibility that the cloud providers offer to give you the ability to still maintain some understanding of what, who's accessing what, when they're accessing them, things like that. Obviously, taking information from your existing data sources wherever possible and combining that data together. So you still have things that are happening locally within your offices. You have the people that are still working locally. And so there's a way of incorporating that data together, combining the data, if you will, and there's new ways of looking at that information. Incident response process is one of the things that has to change because we're used to doing incident investigations using our own information, and now in some cases we can't. We don't have that information anymore, so we need to turn to that cloud provider to be able to help us, or the hosting provider to be able to help us, and they need to actually be part of that solution. Talking about mapping the new sources, so that when we look at that cloud provider and we're mapping the information out, we need to spend, almost take a step back and say, hey, how are we doing things today? How are we doing our monitoring, or how are we doing our visibility from a security perspective today? What are the core things that we need to be aware of? And then how can I get that information from my current provider? So call it a gap analysis, if you will. And it's one of the first exercises that should be taking place before you ever move. It's also something you should be doing when you're considering the cloud provider, because if there are fundamental things, if there are critical things that as an organization, for example, for regulatory reasons, you have to be doing, and you can't get it from that cloud provider no matter what, then it's a real challenge. You're going to have to figure out either another compensating control, or that may simply not be the provider for you. So you have to look at those things ideally before you make a move, and not afterwards, which of course is the challenge with security, right? We usually end up doing it at the end once we've already made a lot of those decisions. Security tools. So again, Trend Micro talked about their tools. Sumo Logic's made the right decision right off the bat, which is they are just a cloud-based solution, so they're not dealing with having to do stuff locally at all, which is great. But there's a lot of tools that we have in our current environment that we need to replicate that functionality when we move to the cloud. So we have obviously firewalls, IPS, things like that, intrusion prevention, web application firewalls. Again, companies like Amazon provide a lot of those services for you when you move into their environment. It's a question of whether you're going to leverage their technology, you're going to take a Trend Micro and use their virtual appliance. There's lots of different virtual solutions that can be transferred over to the cloud environment. But once again, it's a question of looking at that level of service or that level of security that you have today and making sure that you're ideally, although Peter said not to replicate, so I agree it's not just a matter of moving one-to-one, but it's certainly a matter of not losing any of the functionality you have today. So if we go with Kent's logic that there's an opportunity to do something superior, it's looking at what we're doing right now and looking to see how we can do that as good or even better in that cloud environment once we've moved. A lot of times when we move to the cloud, there's also some other third party involved, so there's an opportunity to leverage the technology that they have. But again, we need to make sure that what we're getting is going to give us the same or superior security, because we don't want to sacrifice things, or we don't want to compromise things just because of a move to the cloud. And then certainly we talk about people like CloudCheckr who are here today. They provide a lot of that functionality. They provide the capabilities, and they certainly provide ways to streamline it when you're moving to companies like Amazon. So it makes it a lot easier to do. It's not something you have to always be doing on your own. User visibility, again, one of the most fundamental things. At the end of the day, once all the other security considerations are considered, we still have to worry about the users. So what are the users doing? When are they doing it? How are they doing it? Things like that. And so when we talk about things like federated identity management, so we have all of our information, locally. We use Active Directory. We have all of our local user information. Once we move to the cloud, how do we ensure we have that same level of user understanding, user access, user authentication, and then user tracking? So it's leveraging technology and making sure the cloud provider can give you that functionality, or putting something in place to make sure you do that. And of course, from a user point, we don't want users to have to be logging into different things using different accounts if we can avoid that, because A, it becomes a real challenge for the users. B, it becomes a real challenge for us from a security perspective to actually track all those things that are happening, all the things that are going on. Encrypted sessions become a new challenge, because when everything's on our network and we're looking at traffic or we're looking at user behavior internally, we don't typically have encryption inside our network. So now all of a sudden we've put these things outside the network, and encryption becomes a real issue. So how do we maintain that same level of visibility so that when users are going to cloud services, we understand what files they're storing where, we understand the information that's being transmitted back and forth, so that we can still maintain, from a security perspective, an understanding of the things that are happening. And again, just like looking at the security activity, the things that we're monitoring, we need to understand what users are doing today, so that when we, and what we're monitoring, just as importantly, what we understand, so that when we move to the cloud, we've mapped out all those activities, and we've come up with a way of ensuring that once the move is done, we're going to be able to have that same or even better levels of visibility. It's one of the biggest challenges, at least in my experience working with companies that are moving to the cloud, is maintaining that level of visibility, because they've lost something that they had before, something fundamental, whether it's what the activity that users are doing. The file transfers especially is a big one, where people are copying data to cloud services and that. Who's copying it? What are they copying it? Where is the data being stored? How is the data being stored? Who has access to that data? It's one of the biggest areas of concern for most organizations. Is at the end of the day, it's about the data. And so how do we maintain that? And encryption certainly adds another layer of complexity. So you need to have some type of a proxy in place, or some type of a method of getting visibility, or you tie into a lot of the cloud services now have APIs that you can actually use to gain that visibility back. Dropbox does it, other companies do it, but you need to get corporate accounts. You can't just have individual accounts. So you have to have that sort of plan. It has to be strategized, then you have to plan it out. And then finally, the servers and applications. And I mentioned before, from an application point especially, we haven't always been great at logging our applications from a user behavior perspective, from a security perspective. I think developers focus on the performance side. They focus on the error logging and error checking and things like that. We need to make sure our applications are being written so that we can really get effective information out of it. Servers, of course, if we're hosting them, we still have logs there, and so we need to have a way to collect those logs. So if we have a local solution where we've been doing logging, we need to be able to get the logs once the servers are moved to the cloud. We still need to be able to get that information if possible. Ideally, you set the logging levels again the same. We get that same level of information. It adds new challenges, though, because again, before we had all those logs that were local and they were coming in obviously on the local wire, so we've got gigabit plus speeds. All of a sudden now, if we're putting it remotely and we're still using a local logging solution, then we've now got a challenge because we may be using up internet traffic or using up our bandwidth. And so, again, you may have to strategize around not just moving the workloads outside of the environment for the applications, but also for the security tools. Are we moving that logging solution out to the cloud as well? And if we're going to combine it together, then if we still have stuff locally, do we then have to push that out to the cloud? So it's a real discussion, and it's a real overview of understanding where all of that data is and where ultimately it's going to reside and how you're going to use it. And then the last point's an interesting one because, again, a lot of companies, we go back to the application. We're building it to understand who's logging in, what they're doing, things like that. But that invalid logging is just as important because we use that to try to understand or hopefully identify unusual behavior, things that are happening we're not expecting to see. Just because we've moved it to the cloud doesn't mean that we've abdicated responsibility from a security point. We need to make sure that we maintain that visibility so we know what's actually happening. How many people here are familiar with the Cloud Security Alliance? There's a couple of people. That's too bad. Hopefully more people will learn about it after today. You may want to go back and read a little bit of it. So this organization exists to do, their primary focus is to help organizations just like you determine when you're moving to the cloud, who's the appropriate cloud provider for me from a security perspective. So they've basically built what they call it the Cloud Security Matrix, or Controls Matrix, I should say. And it's basically broken down into 13 domains, and each one of those domains have a bunch of things that from a security perspective, they provide guidance on what you should be expecting from a cloud vendor, from a cloud provider. I actually use this in two ways. I use the matrix in two ways. One, to be able to evaluate cloud vendors, so recommend it to companies to use it. If you're looking to go to a cloud provider, it's a very good guide to help you evaluate their security and how it relates to you. But you can also turn it the other way and use it against yourself. So you use it as almost like a gap analysis tool for your own things, or at least an understanding tool to understand the things that you're doing right now, and then you take that cloud, you take the matrix, if you will, which is basically a worksheet, and you can then apply it to the cloud providers yourselves. And so whether you're identifying areas that you're not doing that you would like to be doing, whether you're looking at things that the provider could provide that you could take something you're doing today and you could get them to do it instead. The idea is that, as I talked about sort of all along, you want to be able to replicate as much as possible what you're doing today or make it even better. And so if you can understand what the cloud provider is doing from a security perspective, it saves you a lot of time. There's a lot of standards from a security perspective that they've incorporated into the Cloud Security Alliance, into the matrix. And so the idea is that, if they talk about doing a specific thing, they identify what it satisfies in PCI, or if you're in the utility space in NERC-CIP, or if you're doing something like COBIT or ISO, it actually helps you understand that if these things are being done either by the cloud provider or if you're using it looking internally, how you can actually, how it would help to satisfy any of those requirements. It even gets into things like the PIPEDA, which is our privacy here in Canada. And that's another area, although I didn't specifically call it out before, in the sort of that magical move to the cloud, when we start to look at not just data residency issues, the privacy issues coming up more and more, where companies are constantly violating the privacy of their employees or their customers and not even realizing it by moving stuff to the cloud. Because again, the data inadvertently or planned ends up being in places it's not supposed to be or not expected to be, and all of a sudden we have privacy violations happening on a very regular basis. So that's going to continue more and more. And so things like the cloud, the matrix can actually help you. And of course, as I say, it does tackle PIPEDA specifically as well. This allows you to take your practices, tailor them to the cloud, and as I mentioned, evaluate cloud security as well as your own. So as I say, I mentioned, from my perspective, using it to do a self-assessment, it's a great tool for that. It allows you to not just look at a cloud vendor outside, but turn it towards yourself and understand what you're doing right now to help to prepare much better for going to the cloud, of course. And then you can compare the results, and then the gap analysis, as I mentioned, and then, of course, the overall goal is really ultimately to help you augment your own security, right? The goal is to certainly to ensure that we maintain the things that we're doing now, but just as importantly, if there's opportunities to get better services as we move things out to the cloud, obviously you want to be able to take advantage of that. We talk about and trend. Peter mentioned a little bit at trend. The idea that's mentioned about layers of security. Defense in depth is certainly one of the most effective approaches to managing security, and it doesn't go away when you move to the cloud. If anything, it can be built upon significantly. So you have an opportunity to put in multiple layers of security. As we talk about that, ensuring you have more than one thing to accomplish stuff, whether it's host-based versus network-based, things like that. You've got the virtual firewalls, appliances. You have the ability to leverage the tools that are built into them. A lot of the firewalls, they call them UTMs, the idea of unified threat management. A lot of the technology that's there doesn't get turned on, which is really a crying shame. I see that all the time where a lot of companies buy a firewall for a firewall, or they buy a tool for a specific purpose, and it has other capabilities built into it. So take a look at the tools and understand what capabilities they have, and if you have features and functions that are there that you're not using, if it makes sense, turn them on. Especially when you're moving, there's an opportunity as part of that move to the cloud to actually enable those things and start to use them when they haven't been used before. And then, of course, the idea is to build complementary layers. So you're not trying to build individual things that are working in isolation. The goal is for them to be able to support each other. So you're doing network-based controls, and then you start to move into application-based controls, the web application firewalls, things like that. Each one of them should be able to support the other ones. And in a perfect world, going back to the visibility comment, if you use that visibility information, you actually have an opportunity to leverage each layer of the defense, if you will, to move the security controls closer to the edge. So as an example, when you start to see things happening inside, you're using host-based at a server level or at a device level, and you're starting to see things happen there, you can use your own information for threat intelligence. So instead of just relying on outside sources of things that may be happening outside, you can actually use your own information to understand things that are happening inside. So if somebody's trying to do bad things, for example, at one of your servers, and you're seeing that at a host-based monitoring, why do you want to allow that device to keep connecting to your network? Why not just block it right at the firewall? So you can build your own threat intelligence information and move that out to the edge. And of course, that cuts down on performance and things like that. So it's almost an added bonus. So this is my call to action to you. I think you need to go back, and for those people that are looking to move to the cloud, you need to go do this. But for those that have already moved, I think it's still a worthwhile exercise to understand what you did and how you approached the cloud, right? So understanding the visibility obviously is key. What level of visibility do we have into our systems today? What level of monitoring are we doing today? What level of security do we have in place today? And how, if we're going to move, are we going to ensure we maintain that or improve it? Or if we've already moved, did we actually cover off the things that we knew? Do we still have, or do we now have that same level of visibility? And if you don't, you need to look to get that visibility back as quickly as possible. Take a look at that cloud security matrix. It's free. It's at the Cloud Security Alliance. You can just go onto their website and you can download it. And it's a really useful tool, so I definitely suggest you check that out. And then I think you need to, again, ask those questions. How are we ensuring that we maintain that level? Because there's one thing, and I talk about it a lot, and I talk about attaining and maintaining, because a lot of people are looking to attain some level of security, but then they're not putting things in place to ensure that they maintain a level of security. And that's one of the biggest challenges, is it's not just getting there, but it's staying there. So what are you doing as an organization to ensure that if we're there, if we did the things, here's all the things we were doing before, now we've moved to the cloud and we're still doing those things, what are we doing to make sure that we keep doing it on an ongoing basis? What are we testing? What are we measuring? And then finally, about the data, of course, at the end of the day, the security controls are in place for a reason, and the number one reason is to protect our data. So what are we doing to protect it, and what are we doing to make sure we understand where it is? Because, again, we've got that big shift from internal to external, and now all of a sudden we have the a lot of new challenges to concern data residency being one of them, privacy issues being, and I think the privacy one is a big one that you really need to take a look at as well, to understand, if I take this data and move it out of my environment, am I introducing any new privacy issues? Lots of other questions you can come up with, but these are just a few I hope to get you started. So this is my tagline. I use it all the time, and I really think it's appropriate. You got to secure it before you regret it. So lots of security issues and incidents happening out there, so you need to make sure you've taken appropriate steps to protect yourself. And that's all I have.